Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today. Um, Thank you. To talk to you about using spectroscopy and using Idaho as an analog to study Mars and other planetary bodies. So, what can Idaho tell us about Mars? Quite a lot, actually. So, you might remember a few months ago when Artemis 2 made its flight around the moon. It was all over the news. It got a lot of people really excited about space and science for the first time in a little while. Um, and we have these new technological capabilities that NASA really wants to hone in and tweak and get out all of the kinks, because the next steps from Artemis 2 are to land people on the south pole of the moon and eventually being able to move on to Mars. So let's talk a little bit about Mars's history. So Mars's surface is mostly volcanoes, volcanic deposits, and impact craters. In fact, the largest volcano in our solar system is Olympus Mons on Mars. It's quite large. It's much, much, much bigger than Mount Everest. So there's also evidence that there was surface water on Mars and possibly still active groundwater in some areas. So why do we care about Mars having water? Well, if there's water, there's at least the potential for life. And if there's life, then that would be really groundbreaking and help to answer some fundamental questions that we have as humans, like, are we alone in the universe? So if there was life on Mars, where was it? If there was water on Mars, where did it go? So there's volcanoes on Mars and there's water on Mars. Are there areas where these two things overlap? And if there are, how would we find them? And that's the main research question that I am studying with my research in this project. So right now we have satellites orbiting Mars and rovers roaming around, collecting all kinds of data about Mars and different locations on Mars. But that information can just be numbers without any context or any way to relate that to have some meaning. So in Idaho, the Snake River Plain has been used as a planetary analog for a really long time. The Apollo astronauts trained at Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, and NASA ran their Martian basalt program, which was looking for biosignatures in lava terrains. Dr. Ronald Greeley in the 70s was kind of the first to define Idaho as the location for plains-style volcanism, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Snake River Plain has the same types of lava, the same chemistry, and the same shapes that we see in volcanic landscapes on the moon and Mars. So this makes it a really great way to study these volcanic landscapes. So we can use the Snake River Plain in Idaho, southern Idaho, as a pretty relatively low-cost way to figure things out so that when we deploy some of these same tools on Mars and on these rovers, we're able to better understand the types of data that we get back. So let's talk about my study area in southeast Idaho and why it's such a great place to do this kind of research. So you're probably familiar with Yellowstone, just down the road. It's these big, dramatic, explosive, caldera-forming eruptions, right? Really big booms. And if you've driven across southern Idaho, you might notice that it's very flat. There's this really wide plain with mountains on either side, and occasionally you might come across a dark lava flow. So that's the Snake River Plain. And Yellowstone and the Snake River Plain are related, but they are not the same thing. They behave very, very differently. And that's very important. So if you think of Yellowstone, the Yellowstone hotspot, like a candle under a piece of paper, that piece of paper is the North American plate, and it slowly moves across the hotspot. So the hotspot stays in one place, Yellowstone and all of North America moves over the top of it. And it leaves behind this trail of like burnt paper if it's underneath a candle. And so the Snake River Plain is kind of that slug trail of the Yellowstone hotspot as the plate moved over it. And so it's left behind this zone of really chewed up, stretched out, thin crust. And so that's the Snake River Plain. So Yellowstone itself is sitting over that candle right now, and it's melting that thick continental crust and generating really sticky magma. And that produces those really big explosions, big explosive eruptions that we associate with Yellowstone. But the Snake River Plain is the leftovers. It's that chewed up bit behind that's left over in the wake. So it's not connected to the same plumbing system. So the volcanoes that we get on the Snake River Plain are very different from the Yellowstone volcano. So instead, this thin stretched out crust pulls magma up directly from the upper mantle, like you can see in this figure, which is a sideways view of the crust of the Snake River Plain. So you can see the top of the crust with the whole system of magma rising from the mantle. And so that mantle magma is giving us really runny basalt that doesn't really give us violent explosions. It's really effusive and it just flows. So you can kind of compare the two. If you think of trying to blow a bubble into refrigerated honey with a straw, it's going to be kind of tricky, right? You'll blow and blow and blow, and then finally maybe you'll get a big release of all of that pressure all at once. So that's the big Yellowstone eruptions. The magma has that consistency of like really thick refrigerated honey. But in comparison, if you think about ketchup, the kind that you can just squeeze or, squish out of the ketchup bottle, trying to blow up bubbles into that with a straw, it's going to be much easier. You're still blowing, you're still building pressure, and it's going to kind of bubble up a lot easier, and it's going to run pretty runny. So the Snake River Plain has that catch-up lava that flows really nicely, and it's not these really big explosions of lava. So this basalt flows a lot. So the Snake River Plain currently has 617 volcanic events that are confirmed on the eastern Snake River Plain. So this picture right here, it shows the different types of volcanoes that we have on the Snake River Plain and their location. And so most of them erupt just one time, putting out lava flows and building these low, flat, broad shield volcanoes. And in some places we drill down to see how deep this basalt goes, and in some places it's over a mile thick. So that's millions of years of these just basalt flows building up on top of each other, creating this really, really thick section of basalt in the crust. So the Eastern Snake River Plain, or ESRP, is essentially a miniature version of the same kinds of volcanic landscapes that we have on the Moon and Mars. So it's not associated with big plate tectonic boundaries, which makes it a really great place to do analog research because it is so similar to volcanism on other planets. And all of this in Idaho. Who knew, right? Idaho's pretty great. So we know that Mars has volcanoes, and we know that it had water. So what happens when water and volcanoes meet? So this picture on the left is Diamond Head in Hawaii. There's this big crater, and this is what we call a big hydrovolcanic feature. So usually Hawaii just gives us nice lava flows. It's that catch-up lava. But when rising magma hits that water, either groundwater or surface water, like the ocean, the lava is so much hotter than the boiling point of water that it causes the rapid transition from water to steam, and we get kind of a big explosion that can fragment material and make these nice little craters. So remember, this is a different violent explosion than Yellowstone. Very different behavior, different magmas, different volcanoes. So when I say a violent explosion, that's relative to other types of ketchup-y lava explosions. So this is kind of similar to if you light a match and you blow it out and you stick it in water to make sure that it's out all the way, you hear that little tss sound of the match going out, right? So that little sound is the match having enough heat to force some of that water to turn into steam. So picture that, but at a much bigger scale. So that's what's causing these blasts that create these unique features. So in Hawaii, usually it's just a lava flow, but if you introduce water into the system, like this picture on the right, you get these unique features and this kind of different behavior from this magma. So when we're talking about Mars, we're not talking about big oceans and seas like we have here on Earth right now. But what if there was just maybe a shallow lake or periodic flooding or shallow groundwater that was only there some of the time? So the amount of water makes a really big difference with what you end up with. So these pictures are of King's Bowl in Idaho, and this is a great example of a brief, limited interaction with water and lava. So the lava came in, it hit the water, exploded, and so we get this one-time, just a hole in the ground. But what if instead of that one-time interaction, water kept being reintroduced as the volcano was erupting? Or a lake that was there some of the times, or groundwater that kept seeping in. You'd get something more sustained and more complicated and possibly harder to detect. So that's kind of the middle ground. Not a ton of water, but not completely dry. It's that middle area. So these moderate, sustained water environments are probably pretty common on Mars, or they were when we had liquid water on the surface. And we might be flying right past them in the data that we're getting back from Mars because we don't have a good reference to what that might look like. And so that's what my research is trying to fix. So let me take you to the breaks. So the breaks is in northeast, southeast Idaho. And it's a volcanic field sitting in the Snake River Plain. And the first thing I want you to notice on the right here is Mud Lake, is that lake down at the bottom. And you can see on the left here, we have these craters, these kind of nested craters going north, south, and east, west. So the Snake River Plain as a whole is remarkably pretty dry. There's not a lot of lakes. There's the Snake River, but that's about it. And so Mud Lake is one of the only persistent water surface water sources across this entire volcanic landscape. So anywhere you have surface water, you also have groundwater underneath, and it's all part of the same system. So having surface water in this area is pretty unusual, but then you have a volcano right next to it. So that's a good combo. So here's what the breaks look like up close. So we have these series of nested craters, kind of in a line, and along the rims of these craters, we see these alternating layers. There's some layers that are more resistant and more dense, and then we have some layers that are kind of more crumbly. So these layers are made up of spatter and rheomorphic lava flows. So we're going to explain what those mean and how these rocks are forming. So spatter is a type of volcanic deposit where blobs or globs of molten lava are thrown into the air by the eruption, and they're still hot and sticky when they land on the ground. And so they agglutinate or weld together in kind of a lot of piles of cow pies on top of each other on the ground. So it's common for these runny lavas to start as fissure eruptions, which is a linear feature in a line, like this image in Kilauea right here. And then as the eruption continues, that spatter can build up and create spatter cones, which is like a little volcano. So you can see up there in Iceland, it builds up that cone formation. And as the eruption continues, there might be parts of the volcano where the spatter builds up, and then there's so much of it that it starts to flow a little bit. And so that's where we get those rheomorphic lava flows, or we call them spatter-fed lava flows. So it just continues pretty much like a normal lava flow. So those are both pretty common, and we see these spatter features at the breaks. So one of the first things that I did with this project was to go out into the field and look around at what kinds of rocks we see in this area. And I went through and I identified 5 main types of rock deposits. So I'm going to go through each of them briefly, then we'll go into more depth in a few minutes. So starting on the left, this is sintered scoria. And so this is really fragmented, really porous, bright red material from the most explosive part of this eruption. And I have samples of all of these that you can all come look up at the end. Moving to the middle, we have red spatter, which is kind of that typical spatter that we just talked about. So this is less explosive, still oxidized, partially welded blobs or cow pies of lava. And on the right, we have the gray spatter-fed flow. So this is where spatter was coming down and it started to flow like a normal lava flow. So these are the dense, dark, gray stuff that caps everything else. And so this is pretty baseline for the Snake River Plain, kind of what we would expect. So each one of these looks differently, and as we'll see in a few minutes, they each tell a different part of the story. So these are kind of typical lava deposits, but what's interesting is that we also have what we call lithics. So within the spatter and the scoria deposits, we have these big chunks of other material that didn't come from the volcano itself, which is kind of cool. So we call these lithics. And so these are chunks of pre-existing rocks that were there before the volcano that were blasted apart by the explosion. So we see lithics of basalt, which makes sense because we're in the eastern Snake River Plain and everything is that basalt, that kind of ketchup lava. But we also have chunks of this yellow material, which is made up of lake sediment. And so we call that lake sediment lacustrine. And so finding literal chunks of lake sediment within lava deposits is not normal. Those things usually don't go together. So this is pretty rare and exciting because it directly ties this volcano to water and gives us some important clues for what was happening during this eruption. So we'll come back to each of these in more detail. But first let's pull them all together and kind of tell the story of the volcano. So the story that these 5 rock groups are kind of putting together. So at the bottom of the sequence, over here on the right, we have that sintered scoria, that really crumbly, fragmented part. This is where it all started. So that magma was rising up and it interacted with that water, either a shallow lake or groundwater, and we had that initial blast that fragmented a whole bunch of material. So this is the most explosive, the most water-influenced part of this eruption. And it's full of this lithic material of both the lake sediment and the basalt blocks, right down to tiny grains, all sorts of sizes. So this eruption burns through that initial water supply and then kind of transitions to these alternating layers of the red spatter and the gray spatter-fed lava flows. So more lava-dominated, less explosive, still some water influence. We still find these lacustrine and basalt lithics within these deposits. So it's not that same violent blast. So it's kind of cycling back and forth between wetter and drier eruption conditions as water gets periodically introduced into the system. So this whole sequence, from that explosive wet base to these alternating layers above, that's exactly the moderate water environment that we're looking for. So not a massive water explosive event like in Diamond Head, Hawaii, but not a completely dry lava flow either. So it's something in between. It's that middle ground. So this might be pretty subtle and something that we really need a reference for if we're going to find similar environments on Mars. So that's exactly what this project is building, the spectral data, which brings me to the part where we actually read these rocks with light. All right, so bringing it back to Mars, if there are similar environments, what would they look like and how do we find them? And so the method that I'm using is that light. So spectroscopy is the main method of my research, and spectroscopy is the study of how materials interact with the electromagnetic radiation, which is light. So we use wavelengths in the range of 350 to 2500 nanometers. So on this electromagnetic spectrum right here, this includes visible light, which is about 350 to 850 nanometers. And so that's what we as humans see. That's what our eyes can detect. So, you know, the colors in the rainbow, that's what we can see. But there's a lot of light that we can't see. So UV rays, infrared rays. So the tools that I am using takes more of these wavelengths than just what our eyes can see. And that can give us some really important information. So different materials, in my case, rocks and minerals, they have different molecular structures that absorb and reflect light differently. And so this figure shows the difference in reflectance of different materials. So you can see we have clouds, water, grass, vegetation, and snow. So if you look at these, you'll see water at the bottom in that blue line right there. So water absorbs a lot of that light. So that gives us that really flat line. It doesn't really reflect a whole lot. But if you look at the red line, which is snow, you can see in the, towards the left is our visible light range. And it's much higher reflectance right there, which makes sense. Snow is white, it's bright, hurts our eyes sometimes when we look at it in the sun. But when we get into the longer wavelengths, we can see that there's areas where it's absorbed a lot, where the red line dips. That's where those wavelengths are being absorbed. And so there's a lot that light can tell us outside of what we can see with our eyes. And so this is a really useful tool. So as you can imagine, this would be very helpful for Mars or any other planetary bodies where we can't easily get to them to perform complex analysis. So how do we get this information? How do we get these squiggly lines on the graph? And how do we measure how much of this is reflected and absorbed? So the tool that I use is called the ASD TerraSpec Halo. So it's this handheld instrument. It's kind of like a little ray gun from Star Wars. And so this is a similar instrument to what Artemis astronauts will use on the moon. And a similar instrument is currently mounted to the Mars rovers. So how it works, we take it and we hold it up to the rock, and it sends a beam of light into the rock, and some of that light is absorbed and some of it is reflected. And that reflected light goes back into the instrument and is measured within the instrument. And so that instrument measures reflectance. And so this gives us a graph, like I showed earlier, with reflectance on the y-axis and wavelength on the x-axis. So the higher the reflectance, the less is absorbed and the more is reflected. So you can see that some wavelengths are absorbed more, some are reflected more, and this depends on the material. So that can give us a lot of clues about the material that we're looking at and the composition of the rocks. So in addition to spectroscopy, I also use some other analytical tools. I use microscopes, and I use these to further investigate the rocks and learn their actual mineralogy so that I can validate the results that my spectrometer is telling me. So first of all, I use a petrographic microscope up here on the left. So this lets me look through a really thin slice of rock. So the light transmits through the rock just like a stained glass window. And so I am able to look at the different minerals and the texture in the rock that has really useful information. I also use a scanning electron microscope, which is kind of a big fancy one, and it sends a beam of electrons into a sample, and then the way that those electrons interact with the energy shells of the elements in the rock can tell us what minerals are actually in the rock. So pretty cool. I also use an XRD, which is X-ray diffraction. So this is a lab technique that identifies a mineral in the sample. And it works by shooting X-rays at a crushed up sample of rock. And those X-rays interact with the powdered sample in unique ways, just like a fingerprint. And so we can use that and match it to known minerals that we know the little fingerprint pattern for. So this can also tell us what's in the rock. So a combination of all of these methods can help tell us a story about the volcanic rock deposits that we see at the breaks. And using these tools is really useful on planetary systems because we can do them at a distance. So let's take a look at what spectroscopy and these other methods are telling us about the rock deposits that we see here at the breaks. So I told you a little bit about the story in the order of how it happened in the eruption, and starting with that water and leading to the more dry lava-dominated stages. So when we're looking at what the spectra is telling us, we're going to kind of flip it and look at it from dry to wet. So we're going to start with the driest environment where there wasn't a lot of water involved and work our way to the beginning of the eruption, or where more of that that water was involved. So we're starting with the normal, and when we're getting weirder as we go. So first of all, the gray spatter-fed flow. So if you remember, this is the driest part of our eruption story. And so in the field, on this picture up in the top left, these are those dense, resistant layers that cap the red spatter layers, which are a little bit more crumbly. So much spatter welded together that it started to behave like a lava flow. So we call that rheomorphic lava flow. So you can see how much more massive and resistant this rock is compared to the red spatter above and below it. And then looking at the other data that we collected, so this is a photomicrograph. I guess I have this. So here's the photomicrograph. This is that stained glass tool that we use. So it shows, so the black is the empty space. And you can see the light going through the minerals. And so we can look at those mineral crystals and see what is there. And then the SEM, the scanning electron microscope, that gives us an image like this. So it's kind of staticky, but you can see that there's some larger crystals in here. And so we can look at these and look at the texture and see what it is showing us. So looking at the spectral profile, which is what my spectrometer tells us, that's this figure up here on the top right. So in this sample, it's pretty flat. If you look at the numbers on the y-axis, those are really, really small numbers. And so even where it is absorbing, where we have those dips in the data, it's not really absorbing much overall. And so the lack of absorption features in the sample is pretty meaningful. So we don't see oxidation or hydration features in this rock, so it's pretty dry. We're not going to see those anyways. So this is what a dry, dense, minimally altered volcanic deposit looks like spectrally. So this is our dry end member. So now we're going to move to our red spatter layer, which is those cow pies that are all built up on top of each other. So the field photo up in the top left, right here, you can see those agglutinated cow pie blobs stacked on top of each other. So this is where that lava was thrown into the air, still hot and sticky when it landed, and it welded together. So this is a pretty typical effusive eruption with just minor water interaction. So looking at the photomicrograph and the SEM images, you can see that there's a lot more holes or void space in this rock than the one that we just looked at. So that's pretty different. And the spectral profile up here in the top right shows some more significant absorption features. There are features around 500 and 900 nanometers, so right here and right here. And so if it dips right there, that's pretty important because that means that there's minerals there. Here it's typically associated with goethite and hematite, which are minerals that have, that they're hydrated, they have water in their structure, and they're oxidized or rusty. And so we also have a slight hydration feature, which is associated with water. We see that up here, right here. So since it's dipping right there, that's related to water being present. So this deposit tells us that we're transitioning into a slightly wetter eruption environment. Still some water influence, but not as much as some other deposits that we'll look at. So the basalt lithics are kind of this middle ground. So when they were erupted, probably not a lot of water involved because it was just a typical Snake River Plain eruption. And so these are fragments of that pre-existing basalt from previous eruptions that got caught up and blasted apart during the eruption of the breaks. So these ones range in size from about 1 centimeter to up to 0.5 meter, and they're found throughout both the scoria and the spatter and the gray spatter-fed lava flows. So looking at the photomicrograph and the SEM images down here, you can see that they're pretty different texturally. There's not a lot of empty space. and the crystals are a bit bigger than what we saw in the other ones. So this rock group has some unknowns to it. We know that there was water in this environment, but this basalt could have been sitting underneath the lacustrine deposit, or maybe the lacustrine deposit was there before and this lava flow came on top of it. We're not exactly sure where it came from, but looking at the spectral profile up here tells us an interesting story. So you can see that we have some absorptions in those areas where we have those hydrated and altered minerals and water present. So at about 500 nanometers and 900 nanometers. Oh, here we go. So right here and right here, we have those dips that show us what's going on. We also have a pretty strong dip right at this 1900 and kind of a little one at this 1400. So these two are associated with hydration or water. So this indicates that this rock has been exposed to water and is hydrated, which is not always true for an ESRP basalt. So we'll come back to this one when we look at them all together. So sintered scoria, this is that more explosive part of our eruption story. So looking at this field sample up here, you can see it's full of holes, it's really kind of crumbly, and kind of stuck together, but it's still not as strong. And it has that bright red, oxidized, or rusty color. So that fragmented texture tells us that this material was blasted apart and not a nice, lovely lava flow like we would expect in this area. So the SEM image highlights that vesicular texture. But looking at the photomicrograph, which is right here on the left, so this red circle, depending on the lighting, you might be able to see it, but there's a very small chunk of that yellow lacustrine deposit, which is super cool that it's in the lava deposit at a very, very small scale. So this is really interesting in the spectra. So in the spectra profile, we can see these absorption features related to these oxidation minerals and the hydration features around 1400 and 1900 are also there too. So it has a lower reflectance in the visible range, which makes sense because it's darker. But then it jumps higher into that, the longer wavelengths has a higher reflectance. So this is super interesting, and it'll all come together when we look at everything all together. So the last one is these lacustrine lithics. So like I mentioned earlier, these are from lake deposits that were there in the area that were blasted apart by that initial explosion. So they're usually bright yellow, sometimes they're tan, almost kind of tannish red sometimes. And they range in size from the micro scale into that little tiny microscope slide I showed you, up to a meter across, so about 3 feet. So that's a really big range, and it takes a lot of energy to move a rock this big. And so the SEM and the petrographic images are kind of hard to get information from. It just kind of looks messy. What's interesting in the SEM image right here is that this shows where lava rock is touching this lake sediment. So you can see there's a clear difference. The lava rock has these crystals, and this just kind of looks messy and can't really tell very much from that picture. But the spectra tells us some really important information. So this spectra signature is pretty different from the basalt ones that we were seeing. We have the same hydration absorptions, but much, much stronger than what we saw in the basalt. And it's a lot higher reflectance in the visible range, which makes sense because it's bright yellow versus the basalt is kind of that red or black color. So these hydration features are suggesting that water was present during the time of the eruption and is still in the crystal structure. So, the XRD, which is this bottom right image, so that's, remember, that powdered sample that I shoot X-rays at, and it tells me some information. These peaks are associated with certain minerals that are in this lacustrine. And so minerals like this plagioclase, feldspars, those aren't really found, plagioclase, feldspars, and quartz, Quartz is not in the basalt club. So quartz doesn't show up in basalt. So where did that quartz come from? We're interpreting this as the material that is making up this lake sediment is from the nearby mountains, which are made up of different rocks. And so it's eroding and coming into this lake basin and filling up that lake. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so we've just walked through the 5 different rock groups that we see at the breaks. Each one tells us a different part of the story. So if we zoom out and kind of look at them all together, we can compare and look at these different patterns to see these different patterns. So a few things jump out right away. The lacustrine lithics are pretty different than everything else. They have overall a higher reflectance, higher in the visible range. The hydration features are still much stronger than the basalts. So the sintered scoria is this purple line in the middle, and that's this middle ground. So it's lower in the visible spectrum, which makes sense, it's a darker basalt, but then it jumps up. So if you remember that microscope image that I showed you with that little piece of lacustrine in it, that's on the micro scale. So when I'm zapping the rock with my handheld spectrometer, it might be picking up really, really small bits of the lacustrine and creating a mixed signal of these different rocks. All right, so the red spatter and the basalt lithics are these red and green lines, and they're actually pretty similar looking. They kind of follow the same patterns. And so they share some oxidation features, which makes sense that they're both in that slightly more explosive water-influenced part of the deposit. And they do have some differences in the shape of their curves. But the gray spatter-fed lava flow is this blue line that's really flat along the bottom. So there's not a lot of absorption features here indicating hydration, alteration, or oxidation. So this is that dry end member of the lava-dominated eruption part of the story. So looking at all of these together tells us an important story. So what does it mean when we put it all together? We have these 5 distinct spectral signatures that correspond to different stages in the eruption environment along that wet to dry change over time. So from explosive water-influenced scoria to the oxidized spatter to the dense welded lava flow. So right now we have orbiters and satellites and rovers collecting spectral data, very similar to what I am doing here. But those instruments can only tell you what something looks like spectrally. They need a reference to what those signals actually mean geologically. So we need the two to kind of put together what they're meaning. So that's what this study is building. So by establishing what these rocks look like in the spectra here at the breaks, where we can walk around, collect samples, look at them under microscopes, and actually confirm what minerals are present, we can create that reference framework. So when a rover on Mars encounters a volcanic terrain with a history of lava-water interaction, we have something to compare it against. So there's one limitation I want to address. So the lacustrine deposits here at the breaks are made up of sediment that was washed down from the mountains, quartz and feldspars, and that's very specific to this region of Idaho. And so that's probably not what Mars lacustrine samples are going to look like. So we're not saying to go look for these exact spectra on Mars, but we are saying look at these patterns and the behavioral relationship between the end members from dry with little alteration and hydration features to progressively more and more hydrated and altered absorption features. So that pattern is what's transferable. And so that's actually pretty powerful. Because what we've shown is that even subtle, periodic, low-intensity water interaction leaves detectable spectral fingerprints. So not just the obvious deposits like the lacustrine class, but in the volcanic rocks themselves. So that basalt lithic that was sitting in a water-saturated environment told us that through the spectra, even though there's not any visible lacustrine materials in it. It's just basalt. But it was telling us that it was kind of sitting in water for a while. So that's exactly the kind of subtle signals that we might be missing on Mars right now. So where do we go from here? What's next with this study? So the volcanic history of Mud Lake is still being worked out. I told you all a story of what I think is going on, but there's some problems with that. There's a question of all of that material from the inside of the craters. Where did it go? We don't know yet. So we're still trying to figure out what was happening with this volcano, because it's pretty unique, kind of weird. There's not a lot for us to actually compare it to that we can observe these eruptions actually happening. So there's still a lot of unknowns. We're still trying to figure that out. I have colleagues that are actively investigating the stratigraphy, or the layers. That's what this picture on the left is showing. She's measuring how big these deposits are. And then I also have some colleagues working to identify possible similar locations on Mars. So this image on the right is showing a promising location in the Elysium volcanic province on Mars. So I have some other colleagues who are working on that part of the project. So there are also some instrument limitations that I need to work through. So the HALO, the handheld spectrometer that I use, it takes its measurements right on the rock. But the rovers take their measurements from a little bit of a distance, a few feet away. And orbital satellites are taking their measurements from really far away, where the pixel size is about 1 meter or larger. So you're getting a lot of rocks mixed together, and that can influence the spectra. And it might drown out the subtle signals that we're looking at here. So part of what's next is figuring out how to adapt this reference framework, which is still really valuable, but matching it to the types of data that we're currently getting from Mars right now. So this is just one snapshot, but this framework is something that can be built on and continue to grow. So bringing it all home with some key takeaways. So first of all, subtle lava-water interactions leave real detectable spectral patterns, or those fingerprints. So you don't need massive amounts of water or dramatic hydrovolcanic features to see these signals. Even periodic low-intensity water interactions can show up in the rocks if you know what to look for. Second of all, we can define these distinct spectral end members that correspond to different stages in a wet to dry eruption. So the explosive fragmented scoria, the oxidized red spatter, all the way to the dry spatter-fed lava flow, and the lacustrine and basalt lithics all in between. So each of those has a distinct signature. Third, this kind of analog work is really important. Before we can get to Mars and read the rocks on Mars, we need to learn how to read them on Earth and connect them to something that we know a bit better than a planet that we haven't set foot on yet. So we can go and we can sample, we can take these back, perform lots of analyses on them to get a lot more information that we currently have on Mars right now. So the breaks is an important piece of this puzzle, and the framework that we've built here is a step towards being able to recognize these subtle and potentially habitable or previously habitable environments on Mars that we might otherwise miss. And all of this is possible because of a team of people that I want to acknowledge. My research team consists of multiple universities and NASA scientists, and we're all working together on these planetary analogs here in Idaho, including mimicking astronaut walks and navigation, using LiDAR to study the inside of lava tubes, and using drones and satellites to investigate potential areas with water ice on the moon. All of us working together to be able to support research from the moon to Mars and beyond. On this slide, I have some pictures of some adventures that I've been doing involved with my research and the research of my colleagues. I also have an Instagram account that I kind of post about the adventures that I do with my PhD. But with that, I will thank you all for letting me be here, and I'll take any questions that you have. Thank you.